The Well of Loneliness by Radclyffe Hall. Read by JayRaams. Chapter 29. Soon after the New Year, 9 months later, Stephen's second novel was published. It failed to create the sensation that the first had created. There was something disappointing about it. One critic described this as a lack of grit, and his criticism, on the whole, was a fair one. However, the press was disposed to be kind, remembering the merit of the Pharaoh. But the heart of the author knoweth its own sorrows, and is seldom responsive to false consolations. So that when Puddle said, "Never mind, Stephen, you can't expect every book to be the Pharaoh, and this one was full of literary merit," Stephen replied as she turned away, "I was writing a novel, my dear, not an essay." After this they did not discuss it any more, for what was the use of fruitless discussion? Stephen knew well, and Puddle knew also, that this book fell far short of its author's powers. Then suddenly that spring, Rafferty went very lame, and everything else was forgotten. Rafferty was aged. He was now 18, so that lameness in him was not easy of healing. His life in a city had tired him sorely. He had missed the light, airy stables of Malton, and the cruel hard bed that lay under the tan of the roe had jarred his leg badly. The vet shook his head and looked very grave. "He's an aged horse, you know, and of course in his youth you hunted him pretty freely. It all counts. Everyone comes to the end of their tether, Miss Gordon. Yes, at times I'm afraid it is painful." Then seeing Stephen's face, I'm awfully sorry. Not to give a more cheerful diagnosis." Other experts arrived. Every good vet in London was consulted, including Professor Hobday. No cure. No cure. It was always the same, and at times they told Stephen the old horse suffered. But this she well knew. She had seen the sweat break out darkly on Rafferty's shoulders. So one morning she went to Rafferty's loose box, and she sent the groom Jim out of the stable. She laid her cheek against the beast's neck, while he turned his head and began to nuzzle. Then they looked at each other quietly and gravely, and in Rafferty's eyes was a strange new expression, a kind of half-anxious, protesting wonder at this thing men called pain. "What is it, Stephen?" she answered, forcing back her hot tears. "Perhaps for you, the beginning, Rafferty." After a while she went to his manger and let the fodder slip through her fingers, but he would not eat, not even to please her, so she called the groom back and ordered some gruel. Very gently she readjusted the clothing that had slipped to one side, first the under blanket, then the small blue rug that was braided in red and blue, the old stable colours of Malton. The groom Jim, now a thick-set, stalwart young man, stared at her with sorrowful understanding, but he did not speak. He was almost as dumb as the beast whom his life had been passed in tending, even dumber perhaps, for his language consists of words, having no small sounds and small movements such as Rafferty used when he spoke with Stephen, and which meant so much more than words. She said, "I'm going down to the station to order a horse box for tomorrow. I'll let you know the time we start later. And wrap him up well. Put on plenty of clothing for the journey. Please, he mustn't feel cold." The man nodded. She had not told him their destination, but he knew it already. It was Malton. Then the great clumsy fellow must pretend to be busy with a truss of fresh straw for the horse's bedding, because his face had turned a deep crimson, because his coarse lips were actually trembling. And this was not really so very strange, for those who served Rafferty loved him. Rafferty stepped quietly into his horse-box, and Jim with great deftness secured his halter. Then he touched his cap and hurried away to the third-class compartment, for Stephen herself travelled with Rafferty on this, his last journey back to the fields of Malton. Sitting down on the seat reversed for the groom, she opened the little wooden window into the box, whereupon Rafferty's nozzle came up and his face looked out of the window. She fondled the soft grey plush of his muzzle. Presently she took a carrot from her pocket, but the carrot was rather hard now for his teeth, so she bit off small pieces, and these she gave to him in the palm of her hand. Then she watched him eat them uncomfortably, slowly, because he was old, and this seemed so strange, for old age and Rafferty went very ill together. Her mind slipped back and back over the years until it recaptured the coming of Rafferty, grey-coated and slender, and his eyes as soft as an Irish morning, and his courage as bright as an Irish sunrise, and his heart as young as the wild, eternally young heart of Ireland. She remembered what they had said to each other. Rafferty had said, "I will carry you bravely. I will serve you all the days of my life." She had answered, "I will care for you night and day, Rafferty, all the days of your life." She remembered their first run with the hounds together. She a youngster of 12, he a youngster of 5. Great deeds they had done on that day together. At least they had seemed like great deeds to them. She had had a kind of fire in her heart as she galloped astride of Rafferty. She remembered her father, his protective look, so broad, so kind, so patiently protective, and towards the end it had stooped a little, as though out of kindness it carried a burden. Now she knew whose burden that back had been bearing, so that it stooped a little. He had been very proud of his fine Irish horse, very proud of his small and courageous rider. Steady, Stephen. But his eyes had been bright like Rafferty's. Steady on, Stephen. We're coming to a stiff one. But once they were over, he had turned around and smiled, as he had done in the days when the impotent Collins had stretched his inadequate legs to their utmost to keep up with the pace of the hunters. Long ago, it all seemed a long time ago. A long road, it seemed, leading where? She wondered. Her father had gone away into its shadows, and now after him, limping a little, went Rafferty. Rafferty, with hollows above his eyes and down his grey neck that had once been so firm. Rafferty, whose splendid white teeth were now yellowed and too feeble to bite up his carrot. The train jogged and swayed so that once the horse stumbled. Springing up, she stretched out her hand to soothe him. He seemed glad of her hand. "Don't be frightened, Rafferty. Did that hurt you?" Rafferty acquainted with pain on the road that led into the shadows. Presently the hills showed over on the left, but a long way off, and when they came near they were suddenly very near on the right, so near that she saw the white horses on them. They looked dark. A kind of still, thoughtful darkness brooded over the hills and their low white horses. It was always so in the late afternoons. As the sun moved across the wide Wey Valley, it would set on the west side of the hills over the wide Wey Valley. The smoke from the chimney stack bent downwards after rising a little and formed a blue haze, for the air was heavy with spring and dampness. Leaning from the window, she could smell the spring, the time of mating, the time of fruition. When the train stopped a minute outside the station, she fancied that she heard the singing of birds. Very softly it came, but the sound was persistent. Yes, surely that was the singing of birds. They took Rafferty in an ambulance from Great Marvin in order to spare him the jar of the roads. That night he slept in his own spacious loose box, and the faithful Jim would not leave him that night. He sat up and watched while Rafferty slept in so deep a bed of yellow gold straw that it all but reached his knees when standing. A last inarticulate tribute, this to the most gallant horse, the most courageous horse that ever stepped out of the stable. But when the sun came up over Brandon, flooding the breadth of the Severn Valley, touching the slopes of the Marvin Hills that stand opposite Brandon, across the valley, gilding the old red bricks of Malton and the weather vane on its quiet stable, Stephen went into her father's study and she loaded his heavy revolver. Then they led Rafferty out, and into the morning they led him with care to big north paddock, and stood him beside the mighty hedge that had set the seal on his youthful valour. Very still he stood, with the sun on his flanks, the groom, Jim, holding the bridle. Stephen said, "I'm going to send you away, a long way away, and I've never left you except for a little while since you came when I was a child, and you were quite young. But I'm going to send you a long way away, because of your pain, Rafferty. This is death, and beyond, they say, there's no more suffering." She paused, then spoke in a voice so low that the groom could not hear her. "Forgive me, Rafferty." And Rafferty stood there looking at Stephen, and his eyes were as soft as an Irish morning, yet as brave as the eyes that looked into his. Then it seemed to Stephen that he had spoken, that Rafferty had said, "Since to me you are God, what have I to forgive you, Stephen?" She took a step forward and pressed the revolver high up against Rafferty's smooth, grey forehead. She fired, and he dropped to the ground like a stone, lying perfectly still by the mighty hedge that had set the seal on his youthful valour. But now there broke out a great crying and wailing. "Hold me, they're murdering Rafferty. Shame, I say on 'em. And what done it? I ain't him no common horse, but a Christian." Then loud sobbing, as though some very young child had fallen down and hurt itself badly. And there, in a small creaky wicker bath chair, sat Williams, being bumped along over the paddock by a youthful niece, who'd come to Morton to take care of the old and feeble couple. For Williams had had his first stroke that Christmas, in addition to which he was almost childish. God only knew who had told him this thing. The secret had been very carefully guarded by Stephen, who, knowing his love for the horse, had taken precautions to spare him. Yet now here he was, his face all twisted by the stroke and the sobs that kept on rising. He was trying to lift his half-paralyzed hands, which kept dropping back on the arm of the bath chair. He was trying to get out of the bath chair and run to where Rafferty lay stretched out in the sunshine. He was trying to speak again, but his voice had grown thick so that no one could understand him. Stephen thought that his mind had begun to wander, for now he was surely not screaming "Rafferty" any more, but something that sounded like "Master," and again, "Oh, master, master." She said, "Take him home," for he did not know her. "Take him home. You have no business to bring him here at all. It's against my orders. Who told him about it?" And the young woman answered, "It seemed he just knew. It was like as though Rafferty told him." Williams looked up with his blurry, anxious eyes. Who be you?" he inquired. Then he suddenly smiled through his tears. "It be good to be seeing you, master. Seems like a long while." His voice was now clear, but exceedingly small, a small, far-away thing. If a doll had spoken, its voice might have sounded very much as the old man's did at that moment. Stephen bent over him. "Williams, I'm Stephen. Don't you know me? It's Miss Stephen. You must go straight home and get back to bed. It's still rather cold on these early spring mornings. To please me, Williams, you must go straight home. Why, your hands are frozen." But William shook his head and began to remember. "Rafferty," he mumbled. "Something's happened to Rafferty." And his sobs and his tears broke out with fresh vigor, so that his niece, frightened, tried to stop him. "Now, uncle, be quit. I do be speechy. It's so bad for him carrying on in this wise. What will auntie say when she sees him all mucked up with weeping, and your poor nose all red and dirty? I'll be taking him home, as Miss Stevens have say. Now, uncle dear, do be quiet." She lugged the bath chair around with a jolt and trundled it, lurching towards the cottage. All the way back down the big north paddock, Williams wept and wailed and tried to get out, but his niece put one healthy young hand on his shoulder. With the other she guided the lurching bath chair. Stephen watched them go, then she turned to the groom. "Bury him here," she said briefly. Before she left Malton that same afternoon, she went once more into the large bare stables. The stables were now completely empty, for Anna had moved her carriage horses to new quarters near the coachman's cottage. Over one loose box was a warped oak board bearing Colin's stud book title, Marcus, in red and blue letters, but the paint was dulled to a ghostly grey by encroaching mildew, while a spider had spun a large, purposeful web across one side of Colin's manger. A cracked, sticky wine bottle lay on the floor, no doubt used at some time for drenching Collins, who had died in a fit of violent colic a few months after Stephen herself had left Malton. On the window sill of the furthest loose box stood a curry comb and a couple of brushes. The comb was being eaten by rust. The brushes had lost several clumps of bristles. A jar pot of hoof polish, now hard as stone, clung tenaciously to a short stick of firewood, which time had petrified into the polish. But Rafferty's loose box smelt fresh and pleasant, with the curious, dry, clean smell of new straw. A deep depression towards the middle showed where his body had lain in sleep. And seeing this, Stephen stooped down and touched it for a moment. Then she whispered, "Sleep peacefully, Rafferty." She could not weep, for a great desolation too deep for tears lay over her spirit. The great desolation of things that pass, of things that pass away in our lifetime. And then of what good, after all, are our tears, since they cannot hold back this passing away? No, not for so much as a moment. She looked round her now at the empty stables, the unwanted, uncared-for stables of Malton. So proud they had been that were now so humbled, and they had the feeling of all disused places that had once teemed with life. They felt pitifully lonely. She closed her eyes so as not to see them. Then the thought came to Stephen that this was the end of her courage and patient endurance, that this was somehow the end of Malton. She must not see the place any more. She would go a long way away. Rafferty had gone a long way away. She had sent him beyond all hope of recall. But she could not follow him over the merciful frontier, for her God was more stern than Rafferty's. And yet she must fly from her love for Malton. Turning, she hurriedly left the stables. Anna was standing at the foot of the stairs. "Are you leaving now, Stephen?" "Yes, I'm going, Mother." "A short visit?" "Yes, I must get back to work." "I see." Then after a long, awkward pause, "Where would you like him buried?" "In the large north paddock, where he died. I've told Jim." "Very well. I'll see that they carry out your orders." She hesitated, as though suddenly shy of Stephen again, as she had been in the past. But after a moment she went on quickly. I wondered, would you like a small stone with his name and some sort of inscription on it, just to mark the place?" "If you'd care to put one. I shan't need any stone to remember." The carriage was waiting to drive her to Malvern. "Goodbye, Mother." "Goodbye. I shall put up the stone." "Thanks. It's a very kind thought of yours," Anna said. "I am so sorry about this, Stephen." But Stephen had hurried into the brougham, the door closed, and she did not hear her mother.